Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we'll be reading more of A Testament of Hope, the speeches and writings of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today we'll be reading a piece called Where Do We Go From Here? And the little blurb is just one sentence. This was Dr. King's last and most radical SCLC presidential address. Now, in order to answer the question, where do we go from here, which is our theme, we must first honestly recognize where we are now. When the Constitution was written, a strange formula to determine taxes and representation declared that the Negro was 60% of a person. Today, another curious formula seems to declare that he is 50% of a person. Of the good things in life, the Negro has approximately one half those of whites. Of the bad things in life, he has twice those of whites. Thus, half of all Negroes live in substandard housing, and Negroes have half the income of whites. When we view the negative experiences of life, the Negro has a double share. There are twice as many unemployed. The rate of infant mortality among Negroes is double that of whites, and there are twice as many Negroes dying in Vietnam as whites in proportion to their size of the population. In other spheres, the figures are equally alarming. In elementary schools, Negroes lag 1 to 3 years behind whites, and their segregated schools receive substantially less money per student than than the white schools. 1/20th as many Negroes as whites attend college. Of employed Negroes, 75% hold menial jobs. This is where we are. Where do we go from here? First, we must massively assert our dignity and worth. We must stand up amidst a system that still oppresses us and develop an unassailable and majestic sense of values. We must no longer be ashamed of being black. The job of arousing manhood within a people that have been taught for so many centuries that they are nobody is not easy. Even semantics have conspired to make that which is black seem ugly and degrading. In Rogers' Thesaurus, there are 120 synonyms for blackness, and at least 60 of them are offensive, as, for example, blot, soot, grime, or grim, devil, and foul. And there are some 134 synonyms for whiteness, and all are favorable, expressed in such words as purity, cleanliness, chastity, and innocence. A white is better than a black. A white lie is better than a black lie. The most degenerate member of a family is a black sheep. Ozzie Davis has suggested that maybe the English language should be reconstructed so that teachers will not be forced to teach the Negro child 60 ways to despise himself and thereby perpetuate the false sense of um, inferiority, and the white child 134 ways to adore himself, and thereby perpetuate the false sense of superiority. The tendency to ignore the Negro's contribution to American life and to strip him of his personhood is as old as the earliest history books and as contemporary as the morning newspaper. To upset this cultural homicide, the Negro must rise up with an affirmation of his own Olympian manhood. Any movement for the Negro's freedom that overlooks this necessity is only waiting to be buried. As long as the mind is enslaved, the body can never be free. Psychological freedom, a firm sense of self esteem, is the most powerful weapon against the long night of physical slavery. No Lincolnian Emancipation Proclamation or Johnsonian Civil Rights Bill can totally bring this kind of freedom. The Negro will only be free when he reaches down to the inner depths of his own being and signs with the pen and ink of assertive manhood his own Emancipation Proclamation. And with a spirit straining toward true self esteem, the Negro can boldly throw off the manacles of self abrogation and say to himself and to the world, I am somebody, I am a person, I am a man with dignity and honor. I have a rich and noble history. How painful and exploited that history has been. Yes, I was a slave through my foreparents, and I am not ashamed of that. I'm ashamed of the people that were so sinful to make us a slave. Yes, we must stand up and say, I'm black and I'm beautiful. And this self affirmation in the black man's need, made compelling by the white man's crimes against him. Another basic challenge is to discover how to organize our strength in terms of economic and political power. No one can deny that the Negro is in dire need of this kind of legitimate power. Indeed, one of the great problems that the Negro confronts is the lack of power. From old plantations in the South to newer ghettos of the North, the Negro has been confirmed or confined to a life of voicelessness and powerlessness, stripped of all the right to make decisions concerning his life and destiny. He has been subject to the authoritarian and sometimes whimsical decisions of this white power structure. The plantations and ghetto were created by those who had power, both to condone or to confine those who had no power and no uh, perpetuate who had no power and to perpetuate their powerlessness. The problems of transforming the ghetto, therefore, is a problem of power. Confrontation of the forces of power demanding change, and the forces of power dedicated to the preserving of the status quo. Now, power properly understood is nothing but the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, and economic change. Walter Reuther defined power one day. He said, "Power is the ability of a labor union like the UAW to make the most powerful corporation in the world, General Motors, say yes when it wants to say no. That's power." Now, a lot of us are preachers, and all of us have our moral convictions and concerns, and so often have problems with power. There is nothing wrong with power if power is used correctly. You see, what happens is that some of our philosophers got off base. And one of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites, so that love is identified with uh, a resignation of power, and power with a denial of love. It was this misinterpretation that caused Nietzsche, who was a philosopher of the will of power, to reject the Christian concept of love. It was this same misinterpretation which induced Christian theologians to reject the Nietzschean philosophy of the will of power in the name of Christian idea of love. Now, we've got to get this thing right. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power is at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. And this is what we must see as we move on. What has happened is that we have had it wrong and confused it with our in our own country, and this has led Negro Americans in the past to seek their goals through power devoid of love and conscience. This is leading a few extremists today to advocate for Negroes the same destructive and conscienceless, conscienceless power that they have justly abhorred in whites. It is precisely this collision of immoral power with powerless morality which constitutes the major crisis in our times. We must develop a program that will drive the nation to a guaranteed annual income. Now, clearly, in this century, this proposal would have been greeted with ridicule and denunciation as destructive of an initiative and responsibility. At that time, economic status was considered the measure of the individual's ability and talents. And in the thinking of that day, of the and that thinking of the day, the absence of worldly goods indicated a want a a want of industrious habits and moral fiber. We've come a long way in our understanding of human motivation and the blind operation of our economic system. Now we realize that the dislocations in the market operations of our economy and the prevalence of discrimination thrust people into idleness and blind them in constant or frequent unemployment against their will. Today, the poor are less often dismissed, I hope, from our consciousnesses by being branded as inferior or incompetent. We also know that no matter how dynamically the economy develops and expands, it does not eliminate all poverty. The modern the problem indicates that our emphasis must be twofold. We must create full employment or we must create incomes. People must be made consumers by one method or the other. Once they are placed in this position, we need to be concerned that the potential of the individual is not wasted. New forms of work that enhance the social good will have been devised for those for whom traditional jobs are not available. In 1879, Henry George anticipated this state of affairs when he wrote Progress and Poverty. The fact is that the work which improves the condition of mankind The work which extends knowledge and increases power and enriches infrastructure and elevates thought is not done to secure a living. It is not the work of slaves driven to their tasks either by the taskmaster or by animal necessity. It is the work of men who somehow find a form of work that brings a security for its own sake and state of society where we want is abolished. Work of this sort could be enormously increased, and we are likely to find that the problems of housing and education, instead of preceding the elimination of poverty, will themselves be affected by if poverty is first abolished. The poor transformed into purchasers will do a great deal on their own to alter housing decay. Negroes who have a disposable disability will have a greater effect on discrimination when they have the ability or when they have the additional weapon of cash to use in their struggle. Beyond these advantages, a host of positive psychological changes inevitably will result in a widespread economic security. The dignity of the individual will flourish when the decisions concerning his life are in his own hands, when he has the means to seek self improvement. Personal conflicts among husbands, wives, and children will diminish when the unjust measurement of human worth on the scale of dollars is eliminated. Now our country can do this. John Kenneth Galbraith said that a guaranteed annual income could be done for about $20 billion a year to fight ow, 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 to fight and I say to you today that if our nation can spend $35 billion a year to fight an unjust evil war in Vietnam and $20 billion to put a man on the moon, it can spend billions of dollars to put God's children on their own 2 feet here on earth. Now, let me say briefly that we must reaffirm our commitment to nonviolence. I want to stress the futility of violence in the struggle for racial justice has been tragically etched in all the recent Negro riots. Yesterday, I tried to analyze the riots and deal with their causes. Today, I want to give the other side. There is certainly something painfully sad about a riot. One sees screaming youngsters and angry adults uh, fighting hopelessly and aimlessly against impossible odds. And deep down within them, you can see a desire for self destruction, a kind of suicidal longing. Occasionally, Negroes contend that the 1965 Watts riot and the other riots in various cities represent effective civil rights action. But those who express the views always end up with stumbling words when asked what concrete gains have been won as a result. At best, the riots have produced a little additional anti poverty money allotted by frightened government officials and a few water sprinklers to cool the children of the ghetto. It is something like improving the food in the prison while the people remain securely incarcerated behind bars. Nowhere have the riots won any concrete improvements, such as have the organized protest demonstrations. When one tries to pin down advocates of violence as to what acts would be effective, the answers are blatantly illogical. Sometimes they talk of overthrowing racist state and local governments, and they talk about guerrilla warfare. They fail to see that no internal revolution has ever succeeded in overthrowing a government by violence, unless the government had already lost the allegiance and effective control of its armed forces. Anyone in his right mind knows that this will not happen in the United States. In a violent racial situation, the power and finally the army to call on, sorry, in a violent racial situation, the power structure has the local police, the state troopers, the National Guard, and finally the army to call on, all of which are predominantly white. Furthermore, few, if any, violent revolutions have been successful unless the violent minority had the sympathy and support of the non resistant majority. Castro may have had only a few Cubans actually fighting with him up in the hills, but he could never have overthrown the Batista regime unless it had the sympathy of the rest of the vast majority of Cuban people. It is perfectly clear that a violent revolution on the part of American blacks would find no sympathy and support from the white population and very little from the majority of the Negroes themselves. This is no time for romantic illusions and empty philosophical debates about freedom. It is a time for action. What is needed is a strategy for change in American life as quickly as possible. So far, this has only been offered by the nonviolent movement. Without recognizing this, we will end up with solutions that don't solve anything, answers that don't answer, and explanations that don't explain. And so I say to you today that I will stand by nonviolence, and I am still convinced that it is the most potent weapon available to the Negro and his struggle for justice in this country. And the other thing is that I am concerned about a better world. I am concerned about justice. I'm concerned about brotherhood. I'm concerned about truth. And when through violence you may murder a murderer but you can't murder. Through violence you may murder a liar but you can't establish truth. Through violence you may murder a hater, but you can't murder hate. Darkness cannot put out darkness. Only light can do that. And I say to you, I have also decided to stick to love. And I know that love is ultimately the only answer to mankind's problems. And I'm going to talk about it everywhere I go. I know it isn't popular to talk about it in some circles today, and I'm not talking about emotional bosh when I talk about love. I'm talking about a strong, demanding love. And I have seen too much hate. I have seen too much hate on the faces of sheriffs in the South. I have seen hate on the faces of too many Klansmen and too many white citizen counselors in the South who want to hate myself because every time I see it, I know that it does something to their faces and their personalities. And I say to myself that hate is too great a burden to beat. I have decided to love. If you are seeking the highest ground, I think you can find it through love. And the beautiful thing is that we are moving against wrong when we do it because John was right. God is love. He who hates does not know God. He who has love has the key that unlocks the door to the meaning of ultimate reality. I want to say to you, as I move to my conclusion, as we talk about where do we go from here, that we honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of manufacturing the whole of American society. There are 40 million people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And then you begin to ask that question. You are raising questions about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. We are called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace. But one day, we must come to see that the edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. It means that the questions must be raised. You are, my friends, when you deal with this, you are the oil. You deal with this, you must begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You you begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that is 2/3 water? These are the questions that must be asked. Now, I don't think that you have me in a bind today. I am not talking about communism. What I'm saying to you this morning is that communism forgets that life is individual. Capitalism forgets that life is social. And the kingdom of brotherhood is found neither in the thesis of communism nor the antithesis of capitalism, but a higher synthesis. It is found at a higher synthesis that combines the truths of both. Now, when I say question the whole society, it means ultimately coming to see that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated. If you will let me be a preacher just a little bit. One night, a juror came to Jesus and he wanted to know what he would do to be saved. Jesus didn't get bogged down in some kind of isolated approach of what he shouldn't do. Jesus didn't say, "Now, Nicodemus, you must stop lying." He didn't say, "Nicodemus, you must stop cheating if you are doing this." He didn't say, "Nicodemus, you must commit adultery, or you must not commit adultery." He didn't say, "Nicodemus, you must stop drinking liquor if you are doing that excessively." He said something altogether different because Jesus realized something basic. What if man what if a man will lie? That if a man will lie, he will steal. And if a man will steal, he will kill. So instead of getting bogged down in one thing, Jesus looked at him and said, "Nicodemus, you must be born again." He said, in other words, your whole structure must be changed. A nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify people generally, or will thingify them, make them things. Therefore, they will exploit them and poor people generally economically. And a nation that will exploit economically will have to have foreign investments and everything else. And they have to use his military site to protect them. And all of these problems are tied together. What I am saying today is that we must go from the convention and say, "America, we must be born again." So I conclude by saying again today that we have a task, and let us go out with a divine satisfaction. Let us be dissatisfied until America will no longer have a high blood pressure of creeds and an anemia of deeds. Let us be dissatisfied with the tragic walls that separate the outer city of wealth and comfort, and the inner city of poverty and despair shall be crushed by the battering rams of the forces of justice. Let us be dissatisfied until those that live on the outskirts of hope are brought into the metropolis of daily security. Let us be dissatisfied until slums we cast into the junk heaps of history, and every family is living in a decent sanitary home. Let us be dissatisfied until integration is not seen as a problem, but as the opportunity to participate in the beauty of diversity. Let us be dissatisfied until men and women, however black they may be, will be judged on the basis of content of their character and not on the basis of the color of their skin. Let us be dissatisfied. Let us be dissatisfied until every state capital comes a governor who will do justly. Let us love mercy and who will love mercy and who will walk humbly with his God. Let us be dissatisfied until from every city hall justice will roll, down will down like waters, and righteous like a mighty stream. Let us be dissatisfied until the day when the lion and the lamb shall lie down together, and every man will sit under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall be afraid. Let us be dissatisfied, and men will recognize that out of one blood God made all men and to dwell upon the face of the earth. Let us be dissatisfied until the day when nobody will shout white power, when nobody will shout black power, but everybody will talk about God's power and human power. I must confess, my friends, the road ahead will not always be smooth. There will still there will still be rocky pieces of frustration and meandering points of bewilderment. There will be inevitable setbacks here and there. There will be those moments when the buoyancy of hope will be transformed into the fatigue of despair. Our dreams will sometimes be shattered and our ethereal hopes blasted. We may again be tear-drenched, with tear-drenched eyes, have to stand before the bier of some courageous civil rights worker whose life will be snuffed out by the dastardly acts of bloodthirsty mobs. Difficult and painful as it is, we must walk on in ahead with an audacious faith in the future. Audacious faith in the future. I cannot read right now. And as we continue our charted course, we may again um, we may gain consolation in the words so nobly left by the great black bard who was also a great freedom fighter of yesterday, James Weldon Johnson. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died, yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed? We have come over the way, what with tears hath been watered. We have come treading our paths through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the bright gleam of our bright star is cast. Let this affirmation be our ringing cry. It will give us the courage to face the uncertainties of the future. It will give our tired feet new strength as we continue our forward stride until the city of freedom, toward the city of freedom. When our days become dreary and low hovering clouds of despair, and when our nights become darker than 1,000 midnights, let us remember that there is a creative force in this universe working to pull down the gigantic mountains of evil, a power that is able to make way out of the no way and transform dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows. Let us realize we are the moral universe as long as it bends towards justice. Let us realize that William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed to earth will rise again. Let us go out realizing that the Bible is right. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. This is for hope for the future. And both and with this faith we will be able to sing in some not too distant tomorrow with a cosmic past sense. We have overcome. Deep in my heart, I did believe we would overcome. This speech was published under the title New Sense of Direction in Worldview number 15. So yeah, Dr. King talking about there is still work to be done. But yeah, that'll be it for this episode. I'll see you all in the next one. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.